must be someone. A mentor, an advisor, perhaps.
There is no one.
He may not look like a demon. In human form, he could look like anyone. But there be traces of a serpent in his face. The wildness of a jackal in his eyes.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the weekly live stream for the Restituta Orbis channel. I'm your host, Lucius Aurelian, and today we are going to be talking about the Dark Ages. And I'd like to extend a greeting to all Prime Explorers, channel members, frequent viewers, and all others joining the channel. Thank you for joining us. And yes, I am well aware that there are current events that are happening today, as there are happening every day. I am not going to speak of them tonight, but if you feel they're important and you need to monitor them, by all means, and I'd say that in any situation. But I appreciate everyone being here, and we are going to move on because I think the Dark Ages is a very interesting time, and it definitely reflects something that is a bit of a reset. Good to see you, Random FX. Hello, Tracy. Hey, Kathy. Yes, any time can really be dangerous. So what we're going to start with is really discussing what the Dark Ages were, and we have to really understand exactly what the Dark Ages were considered from the historical perspective, because we have to look at the history of the history. And I know that sounds a little bit redundant in a couple ways, but there was a very strong mentality for what the Dark Ages represented. And then strangely enough, once again in the early 1900s, there was a little historian who came about, and an educator, an individual who was known as a medievalist or a history in terms of medieval studies, who decided to change the entire paradigm, the perception of the Dark Ages. Yes, 500 years after it happened. It's another one of those stories. So we look at what the Dark Ages were viewed as, and 400 to 1400s or 5th to the 15th century. Now, a lot of people say that that's a rather large time gap, and the images that we're looking at, we're just looking at what a lot of people think of as the Dark Ages. What made it the Dark Ages? Well, this is the official history we're looking at first. So we're going to look at the official history, and then we'll concern ourselves with what it really may be telling us and why the perception was altered. And when you look at this, you see these great medieval battles. So the Dark Ages, after the fall of Rome, the loss of classical antiquity, the loss of education, the institutions. It was the institutions who fell, the great institutions of government, the Roman army, even though they were corrupt for hundreds of years, according to official history. Once they fell and we collapsed into this period of feudalism, this was the Dark Ages. There were warlords, there was disease, and basically, it resembled a post-apocalyptic setting. Keep that in mind. And so we see other images, and the individual who actually wrote about the Dark Ages was someone who lived through them firsthand. You might recall this person, Petrarch, who was a scholar and also a graduate of Bologna University. And apparently he always wore a red cloak, interestingly enough. I don't know. He kind of reminds me of maybe you could call him Red Adder. If anybody saw the show Black Adder, remember his interesting outfit when he was in the Dark Ages? Anyways, and remember when we say the Dark Ages, we're talking about what's now called the Middle Ages, because if there's one thing we do in history, it's change the terminology. I can't imagine why we do that. But Petrarch wrote about this time frame. He wrote about what was really going on and gave a firsthand account of how people were suffering. Ah, yes, indeed. Well, and it's good to have everybody here. And by all means, share your thoughts, share your opinions, talk amongst yourselves. So times have changed. Seems like the same problems in society. Yeah, it does really feel like things are on a giant cycle. We'll be doing an exploration on that one too, Sky Sage, and when you look and see why we have what's called recursion in so many events. Is it because history repeats itself? Or is it because history is set up to repeat itself? So, in any event, Petrarch wrote about the Dark Ages, and he was also from the University of Bologna, or Bologna University, however you want to say it. And a lot of the things he wrote about were the suffering of people, the fact that the institutions were not capable of handling the suffering. There was chaos occurring. There was constant warfare. There was constant strife. The people were ignored. And there was also a lot of unfortunate realities for people who were considered the serfs, the peasants. Of course, we tend to forget about that when we talk about how terrifying the Middle Ages were. Again, we're breaking down population percentages. But what's interesting to me about Petrarch is the fact that if he was a graduate of Bologna and he was a firsthand account, then certainly what he was writing about would have been accurate. Maybe, maybe. And these tend to be the kinds of images that we associate with the Dark Ages. Now, what does this image invoke in your mind if you're thinking that this is some sort of image that's from this time frame, anywhere between 500 to 1500? Classically, we might say that this is from anywhere from the year 1200 to 1300. Who knows for sure? But these were the kind of representations that they were using at that time to reflect their life situation. Now, what does this convey to you? What do you think these images mean? Ah, yes, death, plague, absolutely. As though you can never get enough of it. That's a very good question. Well, hard to say. If we go off the official history, they were not contacted yet in the Americas. But we'll get to that when we get to the alternative perception of what was really going on. Or a way to ridicule events to discredit them. Very good, Vaughn. Absolutely. The continuous employment of fear. You're right, Tracy, because you tend to see fear employed in many different ways. And you'll see it in artwork that reflects the Dark Ages. Ah, yes. Dead Musos. Death Band. Fear of death. Always the biggest fear, regardless of where you go and what you say. Hey, fairy girl, good to see you. And that's what you'll find in a lot of the artwork at the time, is that they were imposing this fear by showing dead, the death, the fact that death was a common and everyday fixture in society. Now, I want you to think about something. You don't have to answer it right now, but has this really changed? Are we still afraid of death now? And I don't think that has to be any more than a rhetorical question, especially given the events of this past week, right? What are we constantly driven to fear from every single day? It's the physical death. It's a very terrifying thing. Or as Garfield said in the cartoon, if I die, that could really hurt my bowling average. Yes, it seems comical, but nobody wants to die. Everybody wants to do anything to avoid it. Why the Middle Ages are called the Dark Ages? Well, that comes from what Petrarch shared. And oddly enough, many different scholars and the original medieval historians, although there was not technically an official medieval historian, I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms, in the United States until the 1900s. Certainly somebody in the 1800s must have studied it, but it's really bizarre. It's even bizarre in terms of our history of the historians. It's very conflicted. But this is your classic artwork, and it always tends to be about war, death, violence, terrifying violence, unleashed on the masses, unleashed on the nobles, unleashed on the peasants. Just depends who's going at it. But is that really what was going on in the Dark Ages? And what are your thoughts on that? Yeah, BB to the ear. That's a good one. And that might be a lot more truth than we like to believe. But is it all made up, or are there certain events that may have actually happened? And I think we do have indications that there are certain things that happened. It's just not the way that we're told that they happened. And there's no doubt, Cynthia, that constantly we're kept against each other, we're turned against each other. Ah, yeah, some kind of reset, or potentially a series of events that would have followed a reset. Because remember, one of the theories that we have is that when the fourth era was collapsing, it didn't happen overnight, and that's constantly what they tell us about the fall of Rome in the mainstream history. Now, that may be analogous or parallel to what happened, it may not be, or similar events occurred. But in any event, when you look at how these events transpired and you see what was really happening during the Dark Ages, what does it really look like? Does it really look like it's just simply a society that's declining? Or is it a society that's already been destroyed and is doing anything it can to survive? What are your thoughts on that? Well, and there are indications that the world was very different at that time. There are indications that there may have been different things going on. Ooh, that's a very good point, Random FX. What if our timelines can be changed post event? And I think there are some indications of that. There are indications and testimonials from certain individuals that they remember different things. There were different things that happened. Did similar events occur, or are there different timelines that have now become amalgamated or mixed? And you can only access them through certain areas. So, ah, well, and that seemed to be something else that was occurring, or maybe they'd already been invaded and they were just simply trying to hold on to whatever they had left. And who's to say that there was even any organized sides at this time? But we'll explore this idea a little bit more. Yeah, depends on the changes in the treaties taking place. Very true. Now, this is a little bit more of the drag down artwork that you tend to see, and this is a little bit more contemporaneous. And yet, the whole concept of the Dark Ages, especially from 400 to 1400 or 5 to 1500, however you want to look at it, continues to persist to this day. Yes, rewriting history to make it seem like civil conflict. And indeed, that seems to be the go to, doesn't it, Chassis? Hey, DV, thanks for joining us. Killer rabbits running about everywhere, reapers sweeping crops. Yeah, absolutely. And you see that, it comes from some of that artwork. You might remember some of that strange medieval artwork that we looked at last year at this time, where we saw that those deadly human sized bunny rabbits that were killing people. So, yeah, maybe, maybe not. Or maybe that's from a much earlier era. So, could be home bliss, or it could have been much sooner than that, or maybe there's been multiple times that they've taken over. So, hey, Chris, good to see you. PCS World, welcome. Robert, thanks for joining us. But that's what's intriguing about the artwork is what it's really trying to reflect, how much of it is accurate and how much of it may simply be trying to, dare I say, sell the drama. Sell us the drama of what happened and let us become emotionally attached to it. And then the next thing you know, oh, yes, it was the Dark Ages. It was a very terrifying time. Now, oddly enough, you'll find some other artwork that I remember several historians back when I was still teaching would talk about this, and they would say that this particular artwork was a definitive proof that during the Middle Ages, the medieval time, or the Dark Ages, however you want to phrase it, that they knew that the world was a sphere. Yes, does this artwork really reflect sphere to you? I mean, are these giant people that are actually walking on a sphere? What's really going on here? Or does this represent something else? And I only bring this up because I remember there were hours of debate about what this really represented. And there were other debates that really what this represented was an increasing population over time. So, the top image, you have a smaller population in a land that is constrained by a circle. Does it reflect sphere? It's written on a two-dimensional page, so who's to know, who's to say? But then you have more individuals indicating progress or perhaps a population that's growing. Could have other interpretations to it, but the issue is that when you're looking at what you're told is artwork from the time, you have to ask the question, is it really artwork from the time? Or is it something else that's been interposed or introduced in the meantime? Or is it an interpretation by some other random historian or artist from a different time? What are your thoughts on that? Yeah, it's definitely a beyond any shadow of a doubt. You make me laugh, Sean. You make me laugh. What can I say? Nothing to see about people walking upside down. Uh, if we were really in the Dark Ages, how come we have all this beautiful building and music and artwork? Very good point, Kathy, and a very great question. Oh, yes. Look at you paying attention to detail there, fairy girl. Yes, you can connect the dots and get that. There's no doubt about it. Hey, Laura, good to see you. Yeah, the snake eats its tail. Yes, that might have been a little bit of a reference in the intro. Well, I see you're looking at the artistic potential of it there, Dallas. Yeah, that's true. So it really comes down to there's many different interpretations from it. And then, of course, you have a little bit more of this classical image where you have armies that are battling, you have ships on fire, and you constantly have the sky full of dust and ash. And if you watch, yes, I'm going to bring it up, Ridley Scott's film Kingdom of Heaven, where they show the situation in Europe at that time, set right before the Third Crusade, so in the 1100s, at least going off the official history. They show smoke, ash, and snow that's constantly in the air, especially in the opening scene when Balin's wife has died and the priest takes her head off because she was a suicide. And that's also another point of contention because one of the views of the Dark Ages was that the church was not a friendly organization. It was out to get people. There was the Inquisition, and we'll get into that in a little bit and what that may have really represented. Now, is there a dual perspective to the church? Absolutely, because there are things about the church that can represent good and caring for people. There's no doubt about that. But then there's an entirely different side of it. That side of control, that side of selling things to the masses to keep them under control. So yes, it is possible to consider both perspectives at the same time. And that was one of the biggest debates from what they called the Dark Ages. Naturally, they wanted to walk that back because, we can't look poorly upon the church or anything else for that fact. Yeah, no doubt about it, Sissy May. And Michelangelo was definitely one of the first ones to come into that. So, yes, please do. And I appreciate that, Random FX. I greatly appreciate that. Well, was it just that church, Heather, or was it the other formal institutions as well? Another question to ask. And I don't want to get too controversial here because, every religion has its good points and has its points that are questionable. It's like anything else in life. I don't believe there's anything that's as absolute as we are led to believe. But it is a good consideration. And yes, there are a lot of fingers that are pointed at that particular institution. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Yeah, that's right, PJCC West. Good one. Uh, Oh, yes. Yeah, I'm gonna be getting to explorations here of Australia before too long. Canberra is very interesting. It falls into one of those interesting city areas too, Vaughn, beyond any shadow of a doubt. So, well, they have maybe the best way to say it is the institution has that infrastructure, Cynthia. The institutions seem to have that infrastructure, but that's not just religion. That falls in many different institutions. So, ah, exactly, Battlestar Terra, exactly. So, many different ways to look at it. And no, I've got to admit, I was going to watch the trailer for Gladiator 2. And when I popped it on and Denzel was laughing at me, I decided not to watch it any further because I remembered, oh, yeah, Napoleon wasn't that great. So why should I expect anything here? Anyway, you want to watch it, go ahead. But I just thought I'd share that with you. So, yeah, it just depends where you look and what you're going to see when you look at it in certain places. Very interesting. And then, of course, what they try to tell us is that one of the things that came about during the Dark Ages was the rapid improvement of agriculture. Although, how much improvement did we really see in agriculture during the Dark Ages? Or was it just the fact that they were simply waiting for the land to recover from the scars that had been inflicted on it by whatever terrifying event had happened? Because oddly enough, when we look at this, how shall we say, revision of the Dark Ages, that it really wasn't so bad, we'll see that there was evidence, or at least a claim, that the environment, the weather, the climate changed. And of course, yes, got to be careful using that terminology because that'll set off, certain alarms. But they said that there was a period of favorable climate, and then it was followed by a period of unfavorable climate. So it was warm, that made it good, and then it got cold and that made it bad in very simple terms. But that's what the official history tells us. You know what to make of that. Ah, yes, food control, which the entire population is based around as well, isn't it? No doubt about it. Hey, Mark, thanks for joining us. Yeah, and actually, in the UK is where you can still find a lot of examples of the medieval manor, at least in the breakdown of the land. But you can actually find it in the United States too, with the whole concept of the township and the county. It's all broken down along those same lines. Strangely enough, Ark of the Covenant was the original do. Yes, maybe, and it was certainly depicted that way in the Indiana Jones movies, wasn't it? Ah, yes, Mississippi's current climate, no doubt about it. No doubt about it, Chassis. But then there's also these other images that give us a different impression of what was going on in the cities. And we see these very impressive structures. And again, this is purported to be contemporaneous artwork that was done during the time. And we've looked at these before, whether it's Nuremberg or any of the cities in Italy, they give us the impression that they're very well built up. We have many great towers and spires and walls and very clearly masonry construction. But again, this is just an artistic rendering. So we have to remember it could have been done by anybody at any time. And we've got quite an image that really knocks the socks off on that one. Like even in the back here, I mean, yes, these grand cathedrals. Several of these grand cathedrals were built well before the Renaissance, including the one that we look at with Florence Cathedral in Florence, Italy. And so they tend to break out of the whole concept that Europe and Italy, especially, needed to go through any sort of renaissance before they could actually build things like this. And if these are indeed examples of contemporaneous artwork from the time, then they show that they already had the capacity. And of course, we're told that, or we're informed, many of the cathedrals were already constructed at that time. So it's hard to say. It's hard to know for sure. Oh, yeah, only a few times they've come up. Yeah, dragons flying around. Yeah, they're not really showing that, are they? Power generator. Yep. And it gives you the impression there was something a lot more going on, that there was a lot more going on with it. And so it's really hard to say exactly what it was alluding to. And then you have some of the more, how shall we say, insidious images or more threatening images with the creatures and the breakdown of death. Now, one of the things that they try to tell us is, well, yes, it was a very bloody and ruthless time, but why do we have such a recurring depiction of death? Why do you keep seeing it all the time? And what's really going on here? I mean, is this really reflecting death, or is this reflecting some sort of strange creature that might have actually been around at the time? What are your thoughts? Or is it just artwork, someone's wild imagination, during a time when people weren't supposed to show imagination? Ah, Antiquitech, yes. Yeah, you never know. It is interesting, isn't it? Oh, that's a good one, Jamie. Yeah, Fallout 3 scene beyond any shadow of a doubt. Couple ghouls there. Is that what you're referring to? Uh, Old world tech was based on the potential difference between the dirt of the earth and the voltage in the air, which increases as a function of distance. Yeah, a lot of evidence towards that, Joshua. No doubt about it. Oh, good one there, Sky Sage. Yes, referring to vampires. Always gives me the impression that the film Life Force had a lot more truth programmed into it, and the climax of that movie just happens to occur at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. In fact, the city's set around London, so yeah, I can definitely recommend that. Ah, that's true, Chassis. It does show a couple depictions of that, don't they? So could have been human beings who had been exposed to whatever was going on pre or post reset, or could have been something else entirely going on. So it's hard to say, but there are too many depictions that show this to simply be ignored. Portal malfunction, yeah, that could be too, Dwayne. Or what we think of as a demonic influence. Maybe somebody went through a portal and then they had actually been corrupted by some sort of influence that we don't fully understand. I mean, all these are possibilities. Ooh, leprosy, yes. And there's always a lot of references to leprosy. And isn't it interesting how it's shown in a lot of the biblical tales? Wasn't it a plot point when you go back and you watch the original film Ben Hur? No, I'm not going to mess around with the remake, but you know how I feel about that. So, yeah, something like it with the concept of radiation. That's another possibility. So everything's on the table. Ah, parasites. Yes, depending on who we're discussing and dealing with. Philadelphia experiment style. That's a good one, Donna Marie. Yes, because there are several accounts that things definitely did not go well with the Philadelphia experiment. If you're talking about messing with portals and jumping in realities. So, and then many of the tapestries that we have, which depict and show death, and what are they really showing though? I mean, the tapestries are sometimes hard to really make sense of because, yes, we can clearly see a battle going on here. Although, is it really a sensible battle or was that just a method of showing what was happening? And another question to be asked also is how historically accurate are the tapestries? What are they really reflecting and what are they getting at? Because is this really the Dark Ages or is this just what somebody hundreds of years later thought the Dark Ages might have looked like? or the Middle Ages or all the other names that we have for it. It's funny how we always have new names for everything. It's not just history, patterns of weather, technology. We're constantly changing names. Hey, what we called artificial intelligence in the 1900s, we now have a different name for it. And what we call artificial intelligence in the 2000s, it's not what we called artificial intelligence in the 1900s. We just like to change names. We're trying to be more accurate. Remember when they changed blizzard to polar vortex? I do. Yeah, it's probably an invert of some kind. There's no doubt about that. Oh, yeah. The medieval period. No, you're absolutely right. And that's a good way to do it by constantly changing the name and really burning it out of people's collective memories in terms of what was actually happening. And I think that's what we tend to get there, Jamie, is there's several indications that the Dark Ages were a recovery period from a cataclysm. That's what seems to make a lot of sense. And a lot of things point towards that. And this is just more of the artwork that probably reflects what it really was. I think this seems a little bit more accurate. You have a lot of ruins that seem a little bit more advanced dotting the landscape, and it's as though something had happened to the sky. Now, again, that's all we have. We don't have any pictures, we just have artwork. Or maybe we do have pictures. Maybe those pictures that we have of abandoned cities are actually from this time frame. That's something else we have to be cognizant of. And it may seem like a leap, but Medici magic. Yeah, that's a good one, Sky Sage. Good reference there too. Never any shortage of those. Yes, and isn't it interesting, Tracy, how many of our institutions can't ever seem to give us a straight answer on anything, right? But then it all ends up with the whole concern of abbeys and monasteries and how prominent they were during the Middle Ages. And so, what were they really? Well, you remember that we have our reset compound theory. And do the abbeys and the monasteries actually play into that part? Because according to the official history, which this might be something correct from it, these installations, these compounds, were responsible for preserving and storing knowledge from a previous era or age. In this case, the official history tells us that they were preserving antiquity or classical Greco Roman treatises, works, novels, books, plays, the whole nine yards. It was all in these institutions and these compounds. And you might recall when we looked at the film The Name of the Rose, that was actually set on one of these impressive monasteries. This one to be specific, and the filming location. But you look at how well constructed and built up these locations are. They're very remote, but somebody put a lot of effort into building them to survive and last. And indeed, they still survive to this day. And so suddenly that fits your whole theory of it being a reset compound. It backs it up by this being a place where people could survive. They could survive roving bands of marauders. They could survive unfriendly threats that are going on, even if it's an environmental threat or something else that we don't even understand. Or they're just so isolated that whatever force was trying to complete the destruction of the previous civilization just simply couldn't find them. Many different theories, but the prominent theory that's most alluring is the fact that there are libraries that are in these structures and these libraries that contain knowledge. Was it all just in one location or was it spread out in many different locations? So it's hard to say. Yeah, he was really good in the movie. And the original book by Umberto Eco actually has a lot of clues. Now, a lot of people debate on, what's the actual status of Umberto Eco? Was he someone who was trying to share information, or was he someone who was just trying to confuse the account? There's evidence for both. And oddly enough, while he didn't go to Bologna, he did have some affiliations with it. So a lot of different aspects to that seem to come up again and again. And yeah, of course, I couldn't resist throwing in one of the scenes with Sean Connery and Christian Slater. And you might remember one of the portions of the film, the main character played by Sean Connery, he just wants to gain access to the library, which of course is in this tower. It's a very difficult to access labyrinth, and you can easily get lost in it. I still remember that line. Well, it's very difficult to find your way out of a labyrinth, if at all. So yeah, it does kind of look like a mining operation, doesn't it? And they did a good job of really conveying what we would think the Dark Ages looked like. And if you read The Name of the Rose or you watch the film, it really does back up the whole concept of the Dark Ages. Hey, Sherry, thanks for joining us. Well, we definitely see that time and time again, don't we? Well, thanks for sharing that, Cecilia. So, in any event, about done with the first portion here, and we will take a 2-minute break. But before we do, please make sure that you hit that like button and support the channel. And I appreciate everyone being here. And we will continue with our next portion after the 2-minute break. And we're going to look at the Greek Dark Ages. Yes, there were Greek Dark Ages, believe it or not. So we will be right back in 2 minutes. Okay, everyone. So we are back and continuing on. A lot of people aren't aware that there was a period of time known as the Greek Dark Ages. Now, these are the Dark Ages that followed the original Bronze Age or the Great Time of the Bronze Age. And they talk about this occurring from 1200 to 800 BC. Now, I ask you to consider, does this really reflect an actual Dark Age or does this reflect a prior reset? What are your thoughts on that? uh, It's all Greek to me. Yeah, it might be to some people. New to me. Prior reset. Yeah. And that's what it seems to reflect, doesn't it, Robert? That there was something that had happened in the past and that we're referring to another era, another time frame. Without any shadow of a doubt. Now, what you're looking at here, no, not bombs, although it does kind of look that way, doesn't it? Oddly enough, we have this same pattern that we tend to see. And this is supposed to reflect a series of burial urns for someone who is of the nobility during this time frame right when these dark ages hit. Now, you oftentimes see this where there seems to be more elaborate burials, although who the heck knows if that's what this device was originally for. There's a lot of interesting elements to the dark ages that occurred with this Greek time. oddly enough, seen strange creatures and strange apparitions such as this. We'll come back to this in a little bit, but I thought this was an interesting image because it's showing you that there's a time frame that people don't really understand or know. Well, you can't get frustrated about it, Donna, because people are going to see what they're going to see. It's one of the things I've had to accept. So, Spock. Yeah, true, Vaughn. I guess it does have a bit of a Spock vibe, doesn't it? So, or, is Etruscan merely a reference to that earlier era? Is Etruscan a reference to the third era? And then what we think of as Rome is the fourth era, the Tartarian era? I mean, those are all good questions. Yep. Could be, looks alien, looks like some sort of horror character. So it's just a sculpture. Oh, actually, it's a little bit more than a sculpture. Thank you for saying that. Because it does appear actually on the book, The Greek Dark Ages. And you'll see that it's not just a sculpture, but it's actually from that figure. Does anybody know what this creature was called? 100 points for anybody who knows what the creature was called. Yeah, it does kind of look like a goblin, doesn't it, Peter? Ooh, Draco. That's a good one, Cynthia. Ah, does kind of look like a death mask, doesn't it, Donna? Minotaur, you're close. You're in the right area. Ah, there you go, Random FX. Yes, Centaur. Yes, good job, Jamie. Good job, Catherine. Yes, the Centaur. And what's the Centaur? Anybody want to share? Because I'm just going to admit I don't know. What's the Centaur? Kidding, but seeing if anybody else out there knows. Sometimes it's fun to see who knows what. Or maybe we don't know anything. Maybe it was something completely different. There are these images, though, that what had happened was the same thing that happened in what we think of as the Dark Ages after the fall of Rome. So, after the fall of Greece, they had Dark Ages, and there was a lot of warring going on. And yes, half human, half horse. Okay, that's the centaur, half human, half horse. I know. I won't be, that mean. But again, a lot of warring going on, a period of decline, a period of disease and chaos, and many people dying in warring city states and warring areas. Ooh, chimeras. Yes, Tracy, absolutely. Half human and half bull. Or a mythical hybrid of great knowledge. That's possible too, Battlestar Terra. You're right. And it could reflect that genetic engineering, alchemical engineering, the things that we look at, and maybe some that still exist. Cryptids. Yeah, exactly. So many different possibilities. And so that's why, it all leads to why we study that. And there's also the fact that you have similar compounds, if you will, that are still intact to this day across the land in Greece and the Mediterranean. Now, again, these survived. These were built to endure. Were these previous reset compounds from the previous era? Is it a stretch, or could they just be portions of the civilization that were more well constructed? Because remember, some of these facilities or structures have been through two resets. Now, what did that look like? Were these hard resets? Was this plasma fire? Was this a flood? Was it both? Was it a significant flood, or what we think of as the significant flood or the biblical flood? Was that the original reset from the end of the first era? I mean, who knows? I don't really discount anything, but you can see there are similar events occurring, and it goes back to that concept of recursion cycles. And so here's where you see it. Pangea, yeah, could be a part of it. Ah, that's interesting. Direct energy weapons from airships? Yeah, maybe in some mopping up or, some final destruction, if you will, by who was fighting who or who thought they were doing what. Well, I figured this was the perfect night to do it, Vaughn, because I got a feeling it's kind of a night where one can talk a little bit more in the clear, if you follow me. But that's okay. You know, we're just saying what we got to say. But then you also have these interesting, and these will be purported to be archaeological digs where you clearly have people who died in agony. Now, did this really happen? And you might recall that we did a couple explorations on death shrines. And once again, this looks like another kind of death shrine, that these were people who were tortured or died in great pain. And of course, this is from the Mediterranean. And then you have other paintings like this, which is very interesting because, again, it reflects the whole concept of Rome burning, although this is the previous era. This is the Dark Ages of Greece. Now, there's also that whole concept of the sea people that invaded and what's really going on with that. Hey, Tara, thanks for joining us and welcome. Because the Greek Dark Ages are something that were originally embraced by academia, and then they were rejected a little bit, much in the same way that the Dark Ages from the medieval times were, or all the different names that they have for it. Yeah, death by cataclysm. That's a good one, Mark. Yeah, that's a good point there, Albie. When wasn't Rome burning, or in this case, Greece? And they try to make us think that they're the same culture, but were they? They try to tell us that the Romans adopted the ways of Greece, although they also amalgamated the Etruscans, according to the official history, and a slew of others, the Samnites and all those other tribes that were around Italy. But is that what really happened? Oh, yeah. Always interesting how concrete and bricks burn like dry wood. Isn't it, Chassis? Isn't it? uh, But then there's also been other revisions on what really happened, or at least the interpretation. And some historians try to say that there really weren't any Greek Dark Ages. They didn't actually happen. There wasn't this warring period. It really wasn't that bad. It was just more of a transitional time. They adopted iron weapons, and then everything was hunky dory after that. I know that's being a little flippant, but images like this that something happened to destroy the culture of Greece, but no, it didn't really happen. Macedonia rose and Alexander the Great happened. And then after that, Macedon was overcome by Rome, and that's official history. But Rome saw things in Greece, they liked it, and they adopted it as well. Because that's how Rome became an empire, by adopting the ways of cultures they conquered. That makes sense, doesn't it? So many arguments on that one. Well, it gets pretty hot. Why would you want to be protected by things? Don't worry about mosquitoes back then. So, well, it's unclear to a lot of people, and it's hard to say, how much of it was a natural event or an artificial event, or to what extent it happened and where it happened, Vaughn. Yeah, they sure do, Cynthia. They absolutely do, and quite frequently. But then there's also reliefs that were from that time frame and show people suffering and preparing for a great calamity, if that's what you interpret this as. This bottom relief here, the stockpiling of food and supplies, preparing for something that they knew was coming, or it could just simply be some sort of harvest, and that's what was really going on. And historians debate about this all the time and what's really being shown in these pictures. What are they really getting at? And that's the thing. I mean, it's a lot harder to really understand what we're actually looking at, especially if this is separated by a couple eras or if this really is a different civilization. I'm always amazed at how we seem to be able to come to very accurate and adequate descriptions for what's going on. And then once it's accepted, then that tends to be the way we go. And, you throw in those other little tools of academia, financial support, patronage, and pretty much you can get anybody to buy off on any theory, especially if you have the right people behind you. And boy, have we got a doozy for you tonight on that count. Yeah, ancient preppers, if you will. And oddly enough, that mentality has been with us for a long time. So it's come up many different times. So activate volcanoes, manipulation of the weather. Yeah, weather, not the wetter, weather. But things do get wetter because of the flood, right? Yeah, in a manner of speaking. And here's something else to think about, head honcho rocks, and something else I've thought about. Was there really a disaster occurring, or were the people simply informed that there was a disaster that was about to occur? They prepared for it, and then that put them in a worse position. Because there seems to be a lot of evidence that something like that happened before the last reset with a fourth era. But all kinds of things were going wrong there. And then you might have heard of these random sea peoples who were just going around invading and migrating all over the place. So you can kind of look at them as an analogy to the Vikings. Remember, they said that the Vikings were going around conquering, murdering people, or spreading their culture. However you want to look at it, it's viewed many different ways. And then these random sea peoples that were going around, and this is still widely contentious in the mainstream history as well. Because remember, we're only talking about events that were 3,000 years ago, and we've got a really good idea of what happened 3,000 years ago, right? You don't need any firsthand accounts. Things were written, they went between many civilizations, numerous languages, and nobody would ever lie. Historians would never make mistakes, and governments would never change anything. Even though we're told, depending on what nation you live in, that other governments change history all the time. But don't worry, your nation doesn't do it, right? uh, yeah, dim eras. That's exactly right. And hey, Christopher, good to see you. And really, what you're seeing is just a constant revision of it because if you're seeing a revision, it's so nobody really knows what's going on and you really can't actually interpret it. Yeah, there you go. Ancient pirates. And there's been all kinds of things that were written by who were these sea people that just randomly came up and attacked Egypt and Phoenicia at that time, and the Hittites and everybody else, and the Mycenaean Greece, and everybody fell to them and they were just terrible. But who were they? Well, we don't really know. Just call them the sea peoples, and that's that. It's kind of like the Vikings. They came from here, and there's a couple different theories, but again, is that really what's going on? Or is it reflecting something else? Especially if we think about the Greek Dark Ages being after the third era and the reset to the fourth era, because you do get a lot of evidence of that. And this is just another way that you can modify it and explain it in a mainstream format to where it makes sense and it fits into, how shall we say, the current chronology that is the accepted history. And of course, this is debated, and I'm not saying anything that's contentious here because this is what historians spend their time doing all day, every day, is debating certain things. But don't worry, they know their guidelines and they know what conclusions they're supposed to reach. Oh, did I just say that out loud? I guess I did. In any event, thoughts on the sea people? Yes, the serpent sea. Oh, that's a good one, Sky Sage. Ah, you always have something wonderful with words, don't you? Phony seas. uh, well, and that's just it, Mark. And yet, isn't it amazing what links people will go to try to deny that that's the reality? And here's the thing, I mean, governments will even give you reasons why they do this. Well, it's a matter of national security. This is why we have to tell you this. This is why we can't really dive into this much. So, yeah, we're here to help. Exactly. Salamanders. I'm gonna resist the urge there to make a Star Trek reference, Heather. But go west, young man. Land's free, but bring weapons. Yeah, that's true enough. And maybe they were. Maybe they were representative of corrupted human beings from the third era who were now turning against the civilization for whatever reason. We seem to have this other recurring theme of individual humans being corrupted. Now, is that in a spiritual way? Is that in a physical way? Is that in many different ways? There seem to be indicators that that's exactly what's happening. So, hey, 12 years of free indoctrination. Yeah, that's a good way to put it, isn't it, Jason? Oh, wonderful South Park reference there. uh, anyways, so that concludes for the Greek Dark Ages. Now, let's really look at what the Dark Ages were about and what they're remembered as, a time of chaos and terror. So give me 1 second here, and we'll pull up our time of chaos and terror images. And I'm going to start with a little bit of a movie poster here. And I want to know if anybody has seen this 1970 movie called Mark of the Devil. Hold on, let me zoom in on that. Now, this is in the original German, but this is a 1970 movie, Mark of the Devil. And the movie begins with these opening credits and voiceover that make the exaggerated claim. So if you haven't seen it, Mark of the Devil is about the witch hunting and the Inquisition that occurred, specifically set in Central Europe. And in the opening credits and voiceover, it stated they make the exaggerated claim that over 8 million people were condemned as witches and killed, but the scholarly consensus ranges from only just 40 to 60,000 killed. Yes, somebody's heard of it. And yes, I'll admit I am aware of when they said that. Now, of course, that might have just been a marketing trick to get people to go see the film, but yes, Witchfinder General, you got it. But that's what this film revolved around. Now, the question I have is, how the heck did they know it was only 40 to 60,000 killed? I mean, you might recall that we've explored the catacombs on this channel. There legitimately are millions of skeletons that are in catacombs across Europe alone. So, where did they come from? Now, is that to say that there was this witch hunt going on? Or is this what really reflects the Dark Ages? Yeah, exactly. And that's something we have to look at. And it's not always easy to look at, and people don't always want to hear those stories. They don't always want to make those considerations. So it's actually a German movie. German movie. I think it was filmed in Austria. I'm shooting from the hip there, but yeah. And if you go off of the actual evidence that's there, Cynthia, that supports that. That more were probably killed. Although what was actually killing them? Was it some sort of targeted effort to get rid of people from the fourth era before we completed the reset to the fifth era? Yeah, and that's exactly the way it looks like, is it's a trophy room. So anyway, Mark of the Devil. I'm not recommending the movie because yes, they did offer to hand out barf bags and it's a product of its time, but the whole concept of Inquisition, the witch hunts, that's what's affiliated with the Dark Ages. And they did make this movie, and it was a bit of a violent exploitation film, or what they would call a torture exploitation film now, and they've got other derogatory terms for it, but it did happen. And what was really going on with this whole period of horrifying versions and events that were transpiring in a time of chaos and terror? And I think you get it in images like this, where you see different artistic works that show death and show people dying and being overcome by different sorts of creatures. So we're really to believe that this time frame that was not that bad, according to some, had these kind of images and invoke this kind of imagination. Now, here's another question I want you to think about as we go on. Does this still live in our collective conscience today? Does the fall and collapse of civilization, does the mass murder and destruction of human beings, and the land just being completely inhabited by terrors, whether they're terrors of sickness, terrors of death, or existential death, do those still exist in our collective conscience today? Do we still have something in the back of our mind that instinctively tells us to be afraid of these kind of things? Thoughts? Yes. And you can actually show it in many movies, can't you, Jamie? Many examples. And not just in movies, but also all you got to do is, well, if you want to right now, you can go turn on the news. Now, I'm not saying that they play up to that. I'm just saying that what they're reporting, it flings a nerve in the back of our mind that compels us to be afraid, uncertain. Yeah, the stuff of nightmares. And that's where it all comes from originally. Ooh, good one there, Texas. Yeah, ring around the rosies. Great point. And what that originally revolved around, too. Yeah, I think that, and that reflects that our psyche is scarred. And I think it's something that's reinforced, too, Battlestar Terra. Absolutely. So let's look at some more images from this time of chaos and horror. And this is what you'll get, basically people managing bodies, people burying the dead. And this is what you'd expect to see in any sort of terrifying situation. Or does it really reflect what was going on after a reset where somebody was trying to keep something together, trying to preserve something? People were just trying to survive. Yet you always have all these images where you see these very interesting and well-constructed buildings in the background. Now, again, they're just paintings. They don't necessarily prove anything, but they really give us the idea of what could have been going on. And we go back to our good old plague doctor. Now, here's a question for you when we have the plague doctors, because that's the other thing from the Dark Ages that I haven't really mentioned yet, the presence of the bubonic plague, or as historians call it, the Black Death. So, yes, the Dark Ages really weren't that bad. We just had the Black Death, which, depending on where you were in the world, killed 40 to 70% of the population. Some nations were hit harder than others. But how much fear, how much subconscious fear is always invoked when you see the Plague Doctor costume? By the way, do you think the Plague Doctor is even a human being? Thoughts on that? Propaganda. Yeah, no doubt about it. Ah, yes. Always the claws and always the beak. Like it's some kind of Skeksis from the Dark Crystal that's been dressed up in a cloak and a hat. Ah, yes. And a lot of people I talk to, Chris, feel that way. And I'll admit it even trips off something in me. And I actually went a little further to find some better images of the Plague Doctor lizard gizzards. Yeah, no doubt about it. uh, well, they said everything about the plague. Absolutely right. And that's what you tend to get from it is paintings and symbols reflecting that fear. And then you still have all over the land, I think this one's from India where you have these skeletons. It doesn't matter where because you can find examples of it everywhere. Yes, North and South America as well. There's catacombs there too. Although they appear to have been cleaned out, I can't imagine why. That give you the impression of people suffering. And then even more terrifying images of the concept of death, different forms of degradation and decay of the body and how that's supposed to attribute to the fear. Then you also have other forms of artwork. Now, I'm keeping it G rated. I'm only using the baseline artwork here because you don't really have to see images to realize how this affects you subconsciously. But again, you see the same thing. Very well built structures and yet some sort of terrifying event occurring. Isn't this interesting back here? Skull and crossbones below a cross of bones. So perhaps reflecting what's supposed to be a negativity towards the church, although we're told later that that was just propaganda. Wait until we talk about where the Dark Ages ended up. Yeah, it does. It does reflect that plague doctor, doesn't it? And the dancing death. That's true, John. Very true. And the triumph of death. Oh, great one there. Yes, the skeleton dance. I forgot about that. That was very early Disney. Very true. Ugh. Well, and not just that, Calvin looking for Hobbes, but if you've ever been around the Calico Early Man site, it's actually on that lovely road called Fort Irwin Road that you turn off I-15 and go to. There's some real interesting things going on out there as well. So it's really hard to say. But then also the images of caskets of burying the dead, and then, of course, the unfortunate faces of the people doing that. Now, what would be one of the first goals after a reset had occurred if many people had died? And remember that one of the things that have been put in our minds, and oddly enough, this goes across multiple religions, is you bury the dead. And it's considered a religious duty. You don't burn the dead. That's something from a past civilization or a past era, or it's considered pagan, which is terrifying to some people. I'm not saying it is, but I'm talking about what kind of perceptions have been put into people's minds. Burying the dead is one of the most important things. But what's it really reflect? Was it just because they were in a situation that there were so many dead out there that they had to get the bodies disposed of? Or is it reflecting something else? There's many different interpretations behind it, but you'll see no shortage of pictures, artwork that show that they were in a situation in the past where there were so many dead they couldn't bury them all. And of course, this is reflected by what we see in the catacombs. There are actually sets of bones down there. You can go below Paris and you can actually try to count how many skeletons you can see, and not just Paris, but all the other catacombs that are across Europe and across the land. Not enough firewood. Yeah, true. Uh, yeah, that is true. Very interesting area there too, Nevada and California, and especially along the mountains there. Very interesting area. Ah, that's true, Brett. There were many different elements that went into what was involved with that. Maybe. We don't really know though. I mean, I have a feeling that we don't have any idea what the actual components of the real cement are. I mean, we're speculating. We're told, yes, they had volcanic ash, but come on, they love to use that one. Could it have been something else that went into it? Maybe. Oh yeah. Well, and you know what with cemeteries is they seem to be very present to actually give us an impression of something going on. So it's really strange. And if you think about it, it's the primary example of just putting out new stones. And just like you put up a foundation stone in a building or the stone with the date. My favorite though is when you come across one of those old main buildings where they've got a date 1847 and then right underneath 1847, 1982. Yeah. Shows you how legitimate that is, doesn't it? And channel members got to see one of those videos actually from one of the colleges I visited where they did that very thing. So, hey, Castle and the Pastor, thanks for joining us. Okay, so some of the more money shots that I promised. Yes, the plague doctor. And here it gives you the impression almost like this is some sort of actual chemical suit. Now, they try to tell us that, yes, that was the whole reason for this very elaborate getup, this apparatus, is that it would protect the doctor from actually getting the plague. Although, was it that, or was it actually an environmental suit? Was this some other creature that was not a human being that was wearing this and had to wear this to survive? It's hard to say. I know. I'm stretching. I'm speculating. Well, maybe. Yeah, that does have more of a steampunk look to it, doesn't it? Oh, that's an interesting interpretation, Heather. But yeah, I guess I could kind of see that. Yeah, I see what you mean with that. Yeah, good point. Well, hey, it's good to see you again, Rip the Jack through. And thank you for that, Random FX. And for those of you who have new memberships, make sure you check out the member content. Oh, yeah, Stork of Death. It's a good way to put it. Yeah, I mean, that's what it looks like to me, Reality Checkmate. It does look like a gas mask. Ooh, that's a good one. Maybe it was the mining equipment they used. Yeah, good possibility on that one. And then also some of these other images, that just show you all the struggle that's going on. I mean, I like this piece of art because it really displays everything that we're informed that was going on. Now, is this just simply the dark ages, or is this reflecting the complete and total breakdown of a society, of a civilization after a reset? And people are doing anything and everything they can to survive. They are trying to avoid death. And it's almost as though it gives you the impression that they're not just afraid of a physical death. They seem to be fearful of a more lasting death. Of course, we're told that the great works of Dante and the 10,000 levels of hell. Yes, I'm exaggerating a bit there. I know how many levels it is, but there's so many different levels to it. Things can be bad, but they can always be worse. And you should be scared of things being worse and how that seemed to be wired into our conscience at that time. Things will always get worse if you're not careful. And just look at these pictures. So do as you're told to do, and things won't get worse. We promise you. Just keep doing what we're telling you to do, and things won't get worse. And you can look and see how many of these images and how these prevailing mentalities seem to stay with us. And are they still with us to this day? What do you think? Yes, the pale horse. Good reference there. Oh, that's a good one, Brett. Yeah, it did kind of look like a radiation suit too, didn't it? And yeah, for everyone who's joined us, please hit the like button and really appreciate everyone being here. I know, as always, there's a lot going on, and I think this is a pretty good one, as this does really provide a little bit of a connection that we have with where these resets happened. And then for anybody who was ever into playing Silent Hill, and if you're wondering where the concept of the pyramid head came from or the Avenger of Death, it was actually from some of this imagery or this iconography or whatever you want to call it. The flagellants that were occurring at that time. And so again, it reflects that whole time of chaos and terror. Is that? Hold on. That's an Italian Saturday night party of these days. Oh gosh. Uh that's the after party. Yeah, and yet it has become more the dunce hat, hasn't it, Sky Sage? It's funny how you see that. Uh, well, and they appeared in these early paintings, and where did this image come from and why was it trying to invoke fear? And yeah, it's still used to invoke fear to this day. At least the image of it is. And then you'll see it in a couple other paintings and you have the different suits of what's really going on here. And so of course this reflects the chaos and terror that religion has turned on the people. It's no longer there to help the people, it's just simply there to destroy the people. At least that was one of the fears that came from that time frame. Again, why they called it the Dark Ages. You had the Inquisition, you had the church yet being helpless to stop the plague at the time. And so it was really a time frame where people had nothing to turn to, no faith in their institutions. And yet at the same time, that's the fear that's in our mind. Oh, where would we be without our institutions? And so that's always important to keep in mind when we're looking at the Dark Ages. Ah, yes, here's another one of these plague doctor masks. Yeah, I'm going more radiation chemical suit on this one. I could definitely see that. You got the protective inserts there. Because that just looks like a human face, doesn't it? Wizards and witches, yes, no doubt about it. Ooh, pointy hats, pointy heads. Yeah, may well be. May well be, Julia. That's a good point. Yeah, keep your dunce hat on. And then the numerous paintings that you have that just again show the collection of the dead. Was this a siege or was there something else going on? Was there some sort of weapon that was employed that we might think of as a biological weapon at this time? Was that really what was going on with the bubonic plague? Why is it something that just kind of went away? Well, of course, we'll say science discovered the answer. I mean, some people still get it. It's still a problem, but it's really not a problem anymore. Now we've got other problems we need to attend to. Or is it simply reflecting the cleanup of so many dead that it occurred after the reset, whether that was the reset conflict that occurred right before the end of the fourth era, or it was a combination, the reset conflict and then the hard reset that occurred, which it seems clear that something happened. Yeah, all taken together too. Yeah, it does look like Toth, doesn't it? Doesn't it? Yes, it does look very old. And so again, it reflects the nature that we have foundation eras, that civilizations built on top of previous civilizations. Ah, yes. And in Fairy Girl, that's why we come here because we can actually share the thoughts and really make the connections. And so that's why I'm all about people sharing what they have and their ideas and their ways of seeing things because I think between all of us we can get a little closer to the truth and what's really going on. Yeah, several indications. Several indications. And then, of course, you have images like this. And here's where you have the famous clawed fingers of the plague doctor. So, why is that present? What's really happening with that? And how many times did plagues hit after what we're told the bubonic plague occurred? Because they kept coming back up in certain places, leading to all kinds of difficulty. Well, we just needed to improve the sewer system. Well, wait a minute. I thought you said that we had rediscovered the methods of Roman technology and we could employ a successful sewer system. Well, it doesn't apply here. It only applies where you say it does. Ah, yes. Here's one of my favorites just because you got everything here. Yes, the clawed hands, siege going on in the background, fire and destruction. Really encompasses what the Dark Ages could have been about. Oh, let's see what we got if we zoom in here. Yeah, hard to say what's really under that mask. Who knows? Maybe we're just not supposed to know. But always the concept of warfare, destruction, people trying to survive. Yeah. And if you take that in conjunction with the Greek Dark Ages, it seems as though we're seeing multiple resets that are actually woven into the official historical account. Well, I appreciate that and thank you for joining us. You know, Kathy, when you said that, for some reason I heard Gina Davis's voice there from The Fly when she was warning the other lady that Jeff Goldblum brought in and was about to take her through the teleporter. Seth Brundle. uh, yeah, no doubt about it. Oh, that's a good one, Random FX. Yeah, the stork brain's life and this brain's death. Yeah, having those images that are really put into our mind. Very, very true. And then, oddly enough, and this is really strange. Now, I recall somebody showing this. This is a while ago, and I know this can't be contemporaneous. In other words, nobody could have shown this when this was actually happening, saying that this was a map that was depicted at that time of the bubonic plague, because they didn't know about the Americas, right? That was way before that happened, right? Is that a continuity? Clearly, this is something that came later. But I remember getting into about a 27-minute argument. Yes, I remember it very specifically with one of my other professors about the legitimacy of this, because he was trying to convince me that this had to be something. And keep in mind, this is when I had the mainstream perspective, just to clarify that for everybody. He was trying to convince me that this was actually a map and this was a document that was from right after the bubonic plague hit in the 1300s. And I said, okay, well, nobody knew about the Americas in Europe at that time officially. I mean, there's some legends that the Vikings knew about it, but were they sharing those maps? Were they civilized? What exactly was going on? I just thought I'd share that with everybody. For some reason, this reminds me of that scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Of course, it's a good idea. Well, what are your thoughts on this? Yeah. Yes, isn't it funny? No Australia on this. Yeah, so again, another map. It doesn't necessarily prove anything, but the argument was just very interesting. Ooh, notice how Russia, United States, Canada are connected on the map. That's true. Is it reflecting something that was a reality? I don't know. Very intriguing. Well, there's evidence that somebody or something, being the Vikings, were, although were they the ones drawing maps? And of course, I'm just using it to counter the mainstream narrative here, but yeah, isn't that funny? Is it a flat Earth map? I don't know. Could be either or. Used. Oh yeah. Anyways, enough of this. I don't need to go relive this argument again anymore. But yeah, it's just really funny because what you have are conflicting ideas, conflicting timelines, and things that constantly contradict each other. Whether you're talking about the bubonic plague, or in this case, you're talking about the perception of the Dark Ages. Anyways, so we'll move on from this, or actually, we'll take one more 2-minute break, and then we'll go into our last section, because that's the most enjoyable section. Because we're going to talk about how the mainstream tried to walk back the Dark Ages, and then how they tried to change the entire perception of the Dark Ages to say that they were actually pretty great. It's one of the first examples of revisionist history. And we'll get to that right after our 2-minute break. So back in 2 minutes. All right, we are back. Thanks for hanging around, and we are going to transition to our last portion here. The Dark Ages were pretty great, and the first example of revisionist history. And for those of you who haven't been around the channel, you know I've got a little image that I like to use for showing revisionist history, and that's Conan being picked up and swung around, because that's what revisionist history feels like, that we're just getting swung around. So, and this image here, give me 1 second, and we'll pull up our final set of images. And that is that the Dark Ages were actually great. And you're going to see a very interesting mustached individual here. Share screen. And you should be able to see it now. And this particular individual that we're looking at here is all about revisionist history. This is Charles Homer Haskins. He was considered the first medieval historian of the United States, active in the 1900s. He was primarily a historian of institutions like medieval universities and governments. And he was, of course, educated at the finest institutions, John Hopkins, where else? And originally he taught at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So what are your thoughts on that? Yeah, first American historian, first American medieval historian, because don't you find that interesting? So all through the 1800s, there were no historians in the United States that were interested in being, yeah, in being medieval historians. But then the 1900s came along, and this guy was just all about it. That's all right, Adam. I know that's what hit everybody, so it's all good. And like I told everybody, you know, if you want to stay up on it, I understand, and I'm just going to drive on with what I said I was going to talk about. So thanks for joining us. Yeah, let's go to his more well-known image. So yes, here he is, Mr. Haskins. I always find it interesting that his middle name is Homer, but you know, we won't touch that. In any event, it was studying all about this guy that really got me to start questioning things because sorry, Jamie, you cracked me up there. It was really looking into this guy that got me to start questioning things because he was the one who said that the medieval times, the Dark Ages, really weren't that dark. Things were actually pretty good. Things were going great. I mean, yeah, we had holy wars going on, we had constant warfare, but that was actually allowing Europe to revive itself. So it really wasn't the Dark Ages. We need to relook at things. Good old Mr. Haskins here. By the way, in addition to being a teacher, Mr. Haskins was also on President Woodrow Wilson's personal staff to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. That's right, the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. And what does official history tell us about how effective the Treaty of Versailles was? Well, I guess if you're looking for another world war, it was very effective in doing that. But actually establishing a lasting peace, it's just really strange. This guy, Charles Homer Haskins, medieval historian, and President Wilson's going to take him with him to go negotiate the greatest treaty to the war to end all wars. Does that make any sense? And yes, you can look this up yourself and see that's what they tell us. Selected versus elected. Yes, exactly. But this was the guy who told us that it really wasn't that bad in the Dark Ages. Yeah, just a little bit. And oddly enough, Jamie, this was another one of those significant watershed moments for me where I was thinking, wait a minute. So this guy was alive hundreds of years after the Dark Ages happened. How would he have any way of knowing? Did he publish something? Did he come across some new writings, some new research? Nope. He just interpreted what had already happened in history differently. That's exactly what happened. Yes, cloudy ages. Well, you know, and it goes back to that whole we're constantly rediscovering Rome and Greece, Donna Marie. Absolutely right. And that's what this boils down to. And oddly enough, he talks about the Bologna University being a sign that things were going well during the Dark Ages. You know, the same university that Petrarch graduated from. Petrarch, the guy who wrote about how awful the Dark Ages were. But, you know, good old Mr. Haskins here, despite being alive many centuries afterwards, he obviously knows better than the guy who lived through it, right? Makes total sense, doesn't it? Don't question it. And I should note that Petrarch actually got himself a pretty nice retirement gig too. So this just shows you don't have to be an evil dictator. Excuse me, Napoleon was not evil. He was just an emperor. Okay, he was a misunderstood emperor. We don't want to say he's a dictator. I guess it depends on what day we're asking. But you don't have to be someone who tried to conquer the world to get a nice retirement. That's all I'm trying to say. Now, this is an interesting image. This is Bascom Hall in University of Wisconsin, Madison. And you can actually find this on the page. They show that it had this very lovely dome and cupola on it. And yet, clearly, oh, yeah, altered image. Always doing crazy things at the University of Wisconsin. Of course, that's where Mr. Haskins taught. And yes, oddly enough, that place keeps coming up again. I'm not sure why. But we've got an earlier image of it that shows how impressive this structure was. And, we know what the structure was. Nice little dome over here, too, it appears. But you'll never guess what happened to this dome. That's right, a fire, early 1900s. So now the building's still there, Bascom Hall, but it doesn't have the dome on it. So, yeah, once again, we run across this same story. You can't make this stuff up. It's a cheesy place. Yeah, it's yet another one of those things in the Midwest of the United States that gets overlooked with what's really going on there. So, yeah, it does kind of look like the Denver Capitol building, doesn't it? Anyway, it just looks like your more run-of-the-mill academic hall. It just has pediments and columns like they all do. But yeah, precisely. Nope, they just tore it down. You can look up Bascom Hall. It does not have any dome because why do you need it? Okay, that's too funny. Yeah, it's when he went to Minnesota, right? Anyways, so moving on, and we're back at the Dark Ages. Were great. They weren't so bad. But moving on from Wisconsin. Oh, by the way, before I move on from Wisconsin, I found this image of their armory there. Nice little castle building, and that's still standing to this day. So if you go to Madison, check it out. You can find yourself a nice, legitimate armory building. Because, if there's one thing a university needs in the 1800s, it's parapets, I guess. So, oh, and then, of course, this nice construction here where you got the tower and placed into the wall. Easy kind of stuff to do in the 1800s. No worries. Oh, and I don't want to gloss over the actual seal of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Yeah, nothing ominous about that at all. I kind of like the whole eye symbol. Anyways, back to Mr. Haskins' original point. So he claimed that during the Dark Ages, things were swell because there was a medieval warm period. By the way, does anybody know when we actually started recording, according to the mainstream history, what year it was that we started recording the temperature? Does anybody know that? Or at least what they tell us? Easy peasy construction. Yeah, that's right. Well, I'll just give you the easy answer. We tend to think it's the 1800s, but this is actually something they tell us it was in the 1600s. But either way, you can see that this medieval warm period happened way before the 1600s. In fact, the Dark Ages ended before the 1600s. So how exactly do we know there was a warm period? We weren't even recording the temperature. Well, I guess because, we extrapolated the data and, we just knew. And keep in mind, that's the only continuous temperature that they've taken in one location. So that's not everywhere. Yep, there you go. Random FX has it. But yeah, so again, it doesn't make any sense, but just roll with it, okay? So, and again, Mr. Haskins, Dark Ages were pretty great. It was a warm period. This is why agriculture did so well. And don't mind that little thing with the bubonic plague. That was just it was a minor inconvenience. It was a nuisance. Yeah, so what if half the people in your town or your city died, and half your family died? It was a nuisance. You had a warm period. We were learning things. The Crusades were bringing knowledge back to Europe, It was a good time. That's what he'll say. And we had Bologna University. So having one university apparently makes up for all this other destruction, death, and chaos that's going on, according to Mr. Haskins. And oddly enough, that's why they don't use the term Dark Ages anymore. It was the Middle Ages, as they say. You might get some historians that'll admit, yeah, right after the fall of Rome, it was kind of a dark period. But the Carolingians, they were right there and they were ready to go. Charlemagne, or you better call him Charles the Great. Don't call him Charlemagne, especially if you got somebody who says, well, he was actually more Germanic. He wasn't French. Charlemagne is calling him French. Well, apparently the Carolingian Empire was actually France and Germany at one point in time. Oh, that was such a fun thesis paper. Now, does anybody know who this individual is? Yes. Somebody from the UK has to know who this individual is. Because, yes, this actually has a lot to do with revisionist history. So, this is activist Mary Whitehouse. And Mary Whitehouse had quite an issue with television programming in the 1970s and the 1980s. She believed that television programming was depicting things that were too violent and too awful for children to see. And she was a notorious opponent of the show Doctor Who, especially during Doctor Who's most popular period, the Philip Hinchcliffe era. So I guess she wasn't a fan of Sutek. Yeah, really, she wasn't a fan of much of anything, as I recall. But yes, I remember those days. Anyways, so she really came down and didn't appreciate the terror in Doctor Who, the cosmic horror, such as with Sutek, the assassin, the deadly assassin, and the violence that was being shown in it. That was one of her issues, and that's what she was initially famous for. But then when the 1980s rolled around, she didn't like one of my other favorite shows, Robin of Sherwood. Why? Because she didn't like the way that it didn't always show the church in a positive light. She didn't like the violence that was on it because, apparently the Dark Ages were not violent or anything. And she didn't really appreciate the way that it showed some of the direct actions of, how shall we say, Herne the Hunter, if you're familiar with the show, because it had a bit of a pagan flavor. Now, if you actually watch the show, it really is a little bit more balanced than that. It shows that there's light and darkness and everything. It's actually one of the themes of the show. But she didn't like it, and she didn't think it reflected actual history. And so she tried to speak against it. And that's kind of what you have with this revisionist historian, Charles Askins. They don't want you to see that there was this time like this. They want to basically change your perception. And it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum someone's on. When they're trying to censor you, they're trying to censor you. And that's exactly what she tried to do. So, and yeah, we still have that to this day. It just seems to come from all over the spectrum as opposed to just one side of it. Although Robin of Sherwood creator Richard Carpenter had a good response to her. When he met her in person after she was criticizing the show, he said, "Ah, yes, I'm Richard Carpenter. I'm a professional writer. And you're Mary Whitehouse, a professional what?" Anyways. So, yes, they're always trying to change what we see and how we see it. Hmm. Well, what would you call it? When you're attacking every television show and you're trying to say that certain shows are for kids or they're not for kids. I mean, Doctor Who of the 70s was definitely not for kids. So that was quite interesting. Ah, that's true, Fairy Girl. That's true. So it all comes back to the concept of revisionism. And actually, if you take a quote from Ken Burns, creator of our favorite Civil War film, you might recall the fact that he said that how we evaluate a society is how we look at history. And yet there's something very insidious about that because really what they're saying is history is what we tell you it is. So does it really matter what actually happened, or does it matter what we tell you happened? Quite a question, isn't it? Yeah, adult themed. I mean, it's not like they didn't have the rating system. It's not like the shows weren't on late at night. I mean, you didn't see Doctor Who on Saturday morning TV even when it came to the United States. It was on late Friday night because it was terrifying and intense, and that was the United States. So, anyways, what were the Dark Ages really about? So we'll pull off Richard here and get up our Dark Ages. What were they really about? Images. And this is where we'll come to the conclusion of what this exploration is all about. And so when you consider all these images and you have all these terrifying assortments of headgear, outfits, the flagellants, the suffering, you have no shortage of apocalyptic depictions of both the land and the cities. And you might recall that that's still in our collective conscience because where did all this fear of nuclear destruction come from that we seem to have that was just flicked in our mind when they had films such as The Day After and Threads that came out in the early 1980s? Where did all that come from? Yes. Exactly. Well, there comes a point. Does it really matter if they are? Does it really matter if they are, if people believe in the fear that comes with it? Is that really the point? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Maybe that's not even important. Yeah, it's a good point, Brother Adam. And for all we know, they might have been. Yes, doom programming and fear of annihilation. And that seems to be what's really used with it because, anytime you see images like this, these really speak to your greatest fears. Civilization destroyed, people suffering and dying. Although, you know what? One little detail I found very interesting about both the American and the British nuclear war scare films, The Day After and Threads, is that in both cases, after the nuclear attack, guess what was still intact and functioning? That's right. The federal government was still intact and functioning in both situations. So no matter how bad things get, there's always going to be a government, even after a nuclear, and careful, I got to be careful and use this word, a nuclear holocaust. Yes, because they actually use that term for that. But you got to be careful when you use certain words because they only have certain meanings and they can only be applied to certain situations. But, you know, nuclear destruction, but the government's still functioning. The only time you didn't see the government function was in H.G. Wells' film Things to Come. But that's all right because they had a new international government that just assembled itself called Wings Over the World, and they had their gas of peace. But anyway, and they're really cool, snazzy black uniforms. But enough of that. But yes, all these images that this really reflects what the Dark Ages were about. So it seems to be that it was showing a period right after the reset when whatever was left of civilization was struggling to survive before the, how shall we say, new civilization rose and imposed its will on what was happening. And that's why we have these fears that still accompanies all this. Why, when you see these kinds of images of wreckage and destruction and, oh, our great landmarks destroyed, it really hits us hard on the inside. It really triggers a fear in the mind that's instinctive in a lot of ways. And yet it's always reinforced in many different days. And you can find no shortage of images about it. You can find thousands of images that show you what it may look like. Is it real? Well, maybe, maybe not. Maybe the Dark Ages were an easy period. Yeah, the 70s were an interesting time for that too. Hmm. Well, yeah, if there's a way to do that, I would love to get back there. I'd actually love to see if where I was is where it really was, but we don't need to say anything more about that. So, uh, anyways. Yeah, I mean, it just, you want to go into the technical details about it. It is interesting to say the least, but good luck trying to talk about it. So, anyways. Oh, and I'm not recommending this movie, but this was actually some artwork from the 70s that I thought they did a pretty good job on because a lot of people never saw the film DEF CON 4, but they remember the poster from it really well. It was another post apocalyptic film from the 80s, actually made in Canada. And it really shows you the images that invoke the fear and others that do. But in any event, let's get to the final point here. So, what we're really looking at, what were the Dark Ages? Well, we look at the Dark Ages as that period that occurred prior to the reset. Now, when was the hard reset? And the reset war, what was that? Well, what came first? Was the reset war really the imposition of a new civilization, sweeping away the remnants of the old civilization? Anybody who remembered what happened, anybody who remembered there was another civilization and wasn't willing to indoctrinate into the new civilization, or perhaps I should say, assimilate into the new civilization, then they were destroyed and they were taken to the various institutions that were created to deal with them: asylums, orphanages, their children taken to orphanages, the parents taken to asylums, and there were asylums for everything. There were workhouses. And there's something else we're going to explore this coming week with another method they may have done that: the prison ships. Yes, I haven't talked about that yet, but we're going to be exploring that this next week, and it's going to be following the Age of Discovery with Captain Cook. We're going to take a look at that. And then don't forget that with the Greek Dark Age, was that referring to that period after the reset with the third era before the rise of the fourth era? And suddenly these things make a lot of sense when you look at those reset compounds and you have all that evidence. But what are your thoughts on this? Am I just completely out in left field, or is there something with this? Hold on, let me catch up here. Yeah, labor camps, you bet. Continuation of powers, yeah. Switching names again, that's definitely something that happens. Oh, yeah, beyond any shadow of a doubt. I mean, we know what the real name for the reservations are, don't we? And isn't it interesting that the reservations still exist to this day, Sky Sage? Uh, switched off is an appropriate term. Well, this is very true. Yeah, and there's many different ways to look at Rome, even, and Rome is always questionable. So I think that's why the Dark Ages is very important to the research that we do, and that's why I wanted to devote a little more time to it. So, yeah, precisely. Oh, yeah. Where's your dynamite? I had plans to go visit Italy again not so long ago, but it just didn't come to fruition. So, well, in any event, I appreciate everyone being here. And like I said, not going to speak on recent events that happened. That doesn't mean I'm ignoring them, but that's not what I came here to talk about. So, by all means, I hope you enjoyed the exploration tonight. And I'm just going to leave you with a little something. And this is just a little saying. It's actually from a song that I really liked from the 1990s. And this is just some lyrics from it. I've willed, I've walked, I've read, I've talked, I know, I've been here before. It's from the band Live. I might have said the name of the song earlier. Feels like it really applies, doesn't it? All right. Yeah, that's what a lot of people say, and that's all right. I'm totally okay with that. So, well, I appreciate y'all being here, and I'm not sure if I'm going to leave this as is or if I'll just look to edit this and re-upload this for everybody when people aren't looking into different things. Because I understand, if you assess that current events are important, you need to pay attention to them. I'm not here to tell you what to think or what to believe. Just offering you another view, if you will. All right. Well, with that said, please hit that like button, and I hope you have a great week. And looking forward to seeing you on the upcoming explorations. And we'll be doing a live stream next week. I haven't decided if we're going to do another version of the reset compound with the old soldiers' homes or the fate of the U.S. Civil War veterans. Or I'm even looking at going to the 7 Years' War. Those are probably going to be the last two for July, but we'll see. All right. Well, everybody enjoy your week, and thank you for joining me. Lucius Aurelian signing off.